Hello, welcome to our webinar, The Silverchair Universe Presents Figshare, Publisher Approaches to Handling Data. My name is Stephanie Lovegrove Hansen. I'm the Senior Marketing Manager at Silverchair, and we're excited to have you with us today to learn more about Figshare. We have with us Mark Honnell, the founder and CEO of Figshare, and he's going to be talking to us about some of the things that they've seen in working with publishers to manage and display their data. A couple housekeeping things before we get started. You've all been muted, so if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please type them into the Q&A box and we'll be happy to spend some time answering those at the end of the presentation. The webinar is being recorded and a link to the recording will be sent to you afterwards, as well as a copy of the presentation. And finally, when the webinar is concluded, you will get a brief survey. I'd appreciate if you could take a moment to complete that, as it helps us to improve the Universe offerings as well as the Universe Presents webinar series. And now I am going to hand it over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Stephanie. Hi, everybody. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. We have been having some wonderful Wi-Fi situations in London recently. But I will talk fast and hopefully share some light on some of the things that we've been doing at Figshare, some of the ideas we have around data and non-traditional research outputs, as we call them. I will share my screen as soon as Stephanie stops sharing her screen. Perfect. Okay, so you should be able to see a presentation now. I'm sure my co-presenters will let me know if that isn't the case. This will be recorded and sent around. If anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat box and we'll get to them at the end. There are a few things I'd like to talk about today, but I suppose from the publisher perspective, you may not know much about Figshare. You may know a lot about Figshare. We've been going for the best part of 10 years now, trying to provide infrastructure, policy compliant infrastructure for publishers, funders, institutions to do more with these other research outputs. You can think of them as what's gone into the supplemental material in the past, more intuitive ways to deal with content that is not a PDF. But let's start with why should I as a publisher care about anything other than the PDF? And that's not meant as a slight on your part. The publisher role in disseminating content for academics is a hugely important one that won't go away. The peer-reviewed journal article is still going to be the focal point of all research, as it's the story, it's the context, it brings it all together. But there are a lot of people now saying, well, if publishing was invented today, what extra features would it have? And every academic subject now is publishing or producing more and more files. And when we say data, we're thinking about these files. And you can see that these governments are aligning to support public access of research, and that's open access to papers, but it's also open access to data too. So the European Commission is saying that the EU would save 10 billion euros a year if they made the data sets from the research they fund openly available and fair. I'll come back to what fair means in a second. And as of the last year or so, the Open Government Data Act in North America has meant that funders are moving towards making data available as a prerequisite of getting funding from them and as of publishing the research that they fund. So big moves there with the National Institute of Health having a policy coming in on the 1st of January next year that says, if we fund you, when you publish the paper, you have to make all of the data sets, all of the software, all of the videos that back up that paper, you have to make that publicly available. And so I mentioned FAIR. There's this idea of findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable files for both humans and for machines. And some of this is, findable. Well, it's on the internet, it's findable, right? But if you call your dataset, then, or dataset from Hanel et al.'s paper, it's probably not going to be findable in the way that people can discover it through Google, which is what it meant. And one thing that we found from running Figshare and Figshare services is the interoperability and the reusability for machines is really hard without subject-specific knowledge. And this is one of the first reasons why a lot of academics are looking to the publisher to say, how can I disseminate this research? You are the experts. For a lot of society journals, they're the experts in the field. For a lot of researchers, the publisher is the expert in disseminating the content. So it makes good sense that you would want to go to the publisher and say, please help me disseminate these files. And we're seeing more and more places that are indexing this content. Most notably recently is the Google Dataset search, which has quickly become the second biggest driver of traffic to Figshare infrastructure behind normal Google. So a lot of people are looking to build on top of research and indexing it in different ways. So I'm going to talk about a few different areas that have come together this year. The STM 2020 Research Data Year is based on all of those things I've previously told you, but it's sharing data is one of the most fundamental aspects of maintaining the integrity of research. So there is a working group from the STM Association looking at how better to help with data. By partnering with Silverchair, we're trying to take away a lot of the technical infrastructure setup of doing this, so we can get you very far, very fast. And I'll talk to a few of these things and what this could look like for you. So the 4 things I'm going to touch on for the next 20 minutes or so is around policies, and then better supplemental data, if that's what you want, if that's what a first step is. Data is an equal scholarly output as the paper, and then data publishing business models, because obviously there is always a sustainability issue with this. And then we can talk about ways in which publishers, seen as the disseminators of the content, have established very robust business models around this, and how Figshare can help you with that. So if we look at policies, this is just some background information. Again, apologies for patronizing people who may already know all of this, but if you haven't heard this before, this is some interesting information on what is happening around the publishing space at the moment. We see Springer Nature, for example, has a research data services desk. So they are saying, in response to their researchers coming to them and saying, we see Springer Nature as the disseminator of research, how can you help us with our data? They have a service desk and a small team that helps field questions, B, there's a few models of ways in which you can publish your data through them, and C, it's come up with this list of research data policies for every single journal that they have. So there's over 2,000 journals in Springer Nature, and each of them have one of these 4 policy types, which is the least restrictive one is we encourage data sharing and data citation. And then level 4 is data sharing, evidence of data sharing, and peer review of data is required. So every Springer Nature journal has one of these policies, and they've said explicitly it's because more than 85 funders now encourage or mandate research data sharing. Taylor and Francis, something similar. Great minds think alike, but something similar but parallel. So they have, I think they have 5 different policies, and they spent a lot of last year trying to roll this out across all of their journals. It's not an easy thing to do. It's not a switch. You have to encourage your editors that this is the right thing to do, and maybe have them choose one of these policies. And then we start to think about in 2017 to 2019, you saw a research data policy framework for all publishers come together. So very recently was a publication that came out about this called Developing a Research Data Policy Framework for All Journals and Publishers, led by publishers. You can see some of the different policy feature definitions that they have. But if you're trying to get started, this is a very good way to get your head around the context of everything and to have a working group of peers led by this Research Data Alliance interest group around data policy standardization and implementation. So anybody can join this. It's aimed at funders. It's ran by the funders. I'll share these slides afterwards so people will be able to click the links, but you can just Google data policy standardization RDA, and you'll see all of the amazing amount of work that's gone into normalizing policies across different publishers. So that's one thing you can start looking at. And then we'll start to move on to the technical side of things and the more practical things that can be done. So better supplemental data. So Figshare's first offering in this space came about because I personally had, I did stem cell biology. I had videos of cells moving from one side of the screen to the other, and I had nowhere to publish them. I sent them off with my paper to be published at a journal, and they said the files were too big. These are files that were a few megabytes. And there were subject-specific repositories in genomics, which was my field. So GenBank for FASTA genomic sequences that's where you're supposed to put your files. But Springer Nature have found that 70% of researchers' files do not have a home. So that's not 70% of researchers. You know, those who do genomics do have a place to put their genomic sequences, but there are lots of different repositories out there, and there are not enough subject-specific repositories. So publishers are trying to do more with supplemental data, and that's where we came in. So the first thing we do is we give you a data publishing repository. This is your repository. It can live on your domain at data.publisher.com or info.publisher.com. And here you can see the Royal Society, where you have the overarching repository of all of their stuff. And then you can click through and see the different journals each have their own repository as well. And you can filter on the content here and see the different licenses that are supported. Here's Springer Nature on the left. So you can see it's filtered on the most popular videos, and then you can filter by license. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the PLOS repository, and each of the files there link back to the actual article, the peer-reviewed journal. There's a link back to the article to drive traffic that way. But this already is a source of traffic. You may have a lot of supplemental information that isn't being used to its full capacity. So what we do is we make sure that everything gets a DOI. You can, as I said, this can live on your own domain. So it's you can put your own Google Analytics into it. You can see PLOS on their SupInfo have had 50 million views and 15 million downloads of content. And we track alt metrics and citations and everything like that. The other side to better supplemental data is in the articles itself. So here we can see Taylor and Francis. There is an article, and in the supplemental data, we accept any file format and we aim to preview it in the browser. So no longer are you held back by the idea that, well, we can't accept those file formats or we can't accept big files. And this is part of the integration that we have with Silverchair, as a way for those files to seamlessly come over to us, so we can create those repositories for you. Here's another example of another article in Taylor and Francis, where you can see in the supplemental data, you have lots of spreadsheet data. As I said, we accept any file format. We aim to visualize it in the browser, and we visualize over 1,200 different academic file formats. So there's two sides to that, really. It's the repository of content, and then visualization of all of these different file formats. And we can get that set up for you with Silverchair very quickly, as a good step to get you very far, very fast. The visualization of the files on your platform, Springer Nature saw a few things, but one of which was 62% are more likely to submit a manuscript. And this idea is, if you've generated a file from your research, you don't want to convert it to a PDF and have to, hide it away as a link at the bottom of the paper. But if you can have a spinning dinosaur tooth in your paper, it's much more engaging. It meets the researchers where they are, and it adds no extra work for them. So then they can get extra impact for all of these data sets. So when we're thinking about supporting information, a few questions here, why do you have supporting information? A lot of the publishers we speak to say, it's for transparency, it's for reproducibility of articles, and it's for more impact for those papers. And so is it serving its purpose here? That's an open question for the group. I'd be happy to discuss. So a lot of the publishers we work with, working on that first step of doing more with data. You already have the content, you already have the files, no matter what the files are, and we can help you do more very simply through our partnership with Silverchair. And so the next thoughts on this are, where's it moving to next? What are the next levels? So when we think about data as an equal scholarly output, by publishing we have a free version of Figshare at figshare.com, which is anyone can come along, upload their files, add some metadata and make them publicly available, but there's not the control over it. So a lot of your researchers, a lot of your authors may have already done that, and you don't necessarily know about this file being associated with you as a publisher. And so a lot of people are doing this. They are saying, well, if the publisher can't accept these files, they're too big, we'll upload them onto a generalist repository. And so a recent study of 500,000 papers in PLOS and Biomed Central found that linking to research data in a repository via a data availability statement is correlated with a 25% increase in citations to the paper. So if you take that data set and make it a separate scholarly output and say, my data set is here, it lives in this repository, the paper on average gets 25% more citations. So there is extra impact that suggests that publishers should be doing this. And when we think about that repository, what is that repository that we're talking about? It could be Figshare, the free version, or it could be your own repository for your journals. You could be the data repository that they're linking to. And there's a lot of openings that this provides, a lot of interesting routes into publishing more content that we're seeing. So if we look at the growth of this over time since Figshare has been operating, in 2011, we started, and you can see that links to generalist repositories, there's about 475 publications linking to these generalist repositories 8 years ago. And we're at over 20,000 a year now. So that is a 400 times growth, which we're looking at 40 times growth, sorry, 400 times growth, which we are, if you're looking at ramping that up, you can see it's growing exponentially. And we're assuming that a high proportion of published articles, well over 1 million within the next 5 years, will have links to data repositories. So should you as a publisher have your own data repository? You can see as well, when we're looking at who's funding it and where these data sets are being made available, you can see it's big. It's all of the publishers that you'd expect, but it's a big, broad variety. And it's also very broad in the funding. So you've got NSF, Belgium, China, Canada, Germany, it's global, Switzerland, Australia. This is a global phenomenon. And so I mentioned that these repositories, they are compliant with all of the web accessibility standards. So we spent a lot of time working on that so that blind people can navigate the system. And we've also started work on allowing this to be more customizable to you as a publisher. So you can see here some examples of custom domains. This is JStage in Japan. And you can see JACC has gone for multimedia because they're thinking outside the box of where they can go with more research outputs, right? We have a group called CTSNet that has video abstracts of surgeries, which is pretty gruesome to watch, but you know, a video of a surgery makes a lot more sense than a paper describing the steps that you do. And JACC also have these visual abstracts. So you can see here is the faceted search. So you can search across all of their content on their domain. Just as an aside, this idea of uploading content, adding metadata, having someone check the files, but not doing peer review also lends itself very easily to preprints. So we provide the infrastructure for a lot of preprints platforms as well. Tech Archive here, you can see so we'd be interested in having those conversations. It's all the same infrastructure. And we're also seeing that the data sets themselves are being cited. So I've already mentioned that by linking to the data set in a repository is going to get your papers more citations. But here we can see Springer Nature. This is actually some software that they've published on their repository, the Springer Nature repository. And you can see that it's got views, downloads. We track altmetric scores too, but we also look for citations, and we do this through our sister organization Dimensions. So you'll be able to track all of the different outputs that are being cited. So you get double impact. The data sets are being cited, the paper that this is being associated with is getting more citations. So you as a publisher are getting more citations. And then I wanted to talk about data publishing business models, because this is obviously we're looking for sustainability for the publishers, and this is where we're seeing new areas. I've already mentioned Springer Nature doing this. You can publish your data set through Springer Nature. It's on Figshare infrastructure, but they have a team who will check the files for you, make sure that you're doing everything right, and charge a small APC for it. So, you know, there is services being provided and a fee being charged for it. And it's needed because if you look at, every year Figshare does a state of open data report where we survey around 10,000 researchers who give us their feedback on data globally. And you can see in the top graph here, people don't know what license to make their data sets available under. It's a new space for them. They don't know how to publish their data, what they should be doing. And then problems or concerns with sharing data sets. You know, is there costs? Are the data too big? What repository should I use? So these are all questions for the publishers. And so the publishers can provide this service to them, whether it's the publishers themselves or whether it's through an intermediary like Figshare. So I mentioned before this idea of Figshare, of fair data, sorry. So findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. This is the global aim. So if you have a data set and Figshare infrastructure, you can get to findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable for humans, and findable and accessible for machines pretty easily. And then if you add in data librarians to check the files, you can get to this interoperability and reusability, which is really, you know, it is a service. It takes work. Somebody's got to manually check things. And so we are working with organizations to help them do this. So one of those organizations is the National Institute of Health. They are saying, we have a new policy. When we ask our researchers to make their data available, they didn't necessarily have one. So we have a pilot for an NIH repository, and we have members of the Figshare team who are checking these files for them. So these are the checks that are being done. A descriptive title is included. The metadata sufficiently describes the data or links to resources that further describe it. So this is a service that we provide for them, and NIH provides to its researchers at no cost. So they are willing to foot the bill for data publishing. And a lot of organizations are doing this through publishing agreements with publishers. So if a publisher did want to charge a fee for doing this kind of checks, they can do that. Figshare can provide a team to do that as well if anyone's interested in that. And yeah, if you have a business model on top of it, that's your business. We're just the infrastructure on this level. So I've gone through a few different areas here: policies, better supplemental data, data is an equal scholarly output, and then data publishing business models. I feel that the first one is just a general one that is useful to be aware of at all times. 2, 3, and 4 are kind of steps 1, 2, and 3 of developing this, implementing this data strategy. We can get you very far, very fast with number 1 if you're not doing anything through our partnership with Silverchair. So we'd be happy to talk about that. And then 3 and 4 are really, how do you build on top of it? And what are the bigger strategic decisions at the publisher level? So that's everything from me. I think I kept to half an hour. If anybody does have any questions now, I'd be happy to answer them. If not, you can get in touch with me at mark@figshare.com. I appreciate it was a lot of information in a lot of slides in a short amount of time. So the recording will be sent out and we will share these with you afterwards as well. So I will pause for breath here and see if there's any questions from Stephanie.
Thank you, Mark. That was wonderful. No questions in the Q&A yet. I do have one for you, but everyone else, if you have anything, please feel free to type that in now. Thank you very much for that review. It was wonderful. And so I guess one of the things I'm wondering is, as you've been working with publishers, what have been some of the most common roadblocks that you've seen? And also, what are the things that publishers should think about as they start to move toward making supplemental files available?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So there's this balance of most publishers want to do something because they know that their authors are generating pretty much every field, whether it's the humanities or whether it's, neuroscience, are generating digital files. And these are useful in reproducing the paper and building on top of the work that's gone beforehand. They want to provide that service to their authors. They want to have lots of and high quality papers. And so a good way to get more impact is to do something more with all of these files. We heard from one publisher that it got to the point where as soon as they were getting more than one extra file per paper, they had more files than they did have papers. They knew they needed to do something with that. And then the idea of where these, the authors are coming to them and say, what am I supposed to be doing? Where am I supposed to be putting it? By having a solution for that, that is step one, and that is very easy to do, and we can get that set up in a matter of weeks. The interesting part for me is that we really have seen the last 3 years, particularly, these funder policies grow. So everybody is going to have to do this. They're going to have to make their data available. I did a blog post recently called Who Checks, Who Pays, How Much? And we know that the funders want to pay for the data to be checked, but a lot of publishers do not have a team of 10 librarians on staff ready to go. And so we're working with different organizations to say, we have a team who can check these files for you at this level going forward. And it's very much the basic checks, high volume. Whereas I think a lot of research, a lot of publishers, particularly in the society space, see themselves almost as that subject specific repository for papers for that particular field. And so they're looking at ways in which they can become the subject specific repository for data sets and code and software in that field. And then you can get a much higher level of expertise, which obviously will come with a much higher cost to the author for the checks. But this is a new flow of revenue that I think is evident in academic publishing. And so it's how best to come up with a strategy now.
Great. And we do have a question from Gabe Harp at MIT. He says, great presentation. Can you speak to the workflow? The author deposits the data set to Figshare. Then what steps are needed to ensure that it's rendered within the published article hosted online by Silverchair?
Yep, that is fantastic. We also have a webinar happening tomorrow, I think, that we can send around details of, that describes exactly that it's a technical implementation. If my colleague Al is on the call, I'm sure he can interrupt and tell me exactly what time that is. But this is...
It's on this time tomorrow. And that'll be talking through, there's a few different types of workflows, and we'll be talking through all the different types tomorrow.
Perfect, thanks Al. So the most basic workflow that we work with in terms of very fast is you can have it so that your supplemental data is submitted in the same way, and then Silverchair has an implementation to send it over to us and we can grab it all. And with grabbing it all, we then have a repository. Remember that repository can live on your domain. So the author never thinks they're dealing with Figshare or anybody else. They think they're dealing with MIT in this case. And so they send through the publication and says, throw in all your files as well here. We grab as much metadata as we can and create these files, generate DOIs for them. And then there's a few ways in which the preview on the actual article can happen. This most simple way, and those animated GIFs I show you have this rendering, is there is one line of code that is implemented on the platform. And that line of code usually goes in the section that says supplemental data or supporting information. And it says, for this DOI, for this article, this journal article DOI, it queries the Figshare API and says, is there any supporting information we have for this? If yes, pop it up. If no, do nothing. And so any article that has data sets associated with it, it renders them immediately in the page. So that's a very simplistic workflow that's fully automated, and the only work it needs for rendering in the articles is that one line of code. You can have the full repository without the rendering in the code, and then it's fully automated and your team needs to do zero development work. And that's, as I said, starting from a very low barrier to entry and dipping your toe in the water, but getting very far, very fast, using your existing workflows, but doing a lot more with the content. And, being able to filter at the end of June, we have filter on highest altmetric score or highest citations. So you can say, give me all of the videos that have been published in any of our journals and tell me which of them has the highest altmetric score in the last week. Those kind of things that you couldn't do before. And everything, and when I say policy compliant infrastructure, everything that goes along with that, sending metadata to Google Dataset search, indexing in dimensions, all of these things happen as just default off the bat in the background. And then the workflows for more involved procedures, again, can be, so the next step up of publishing data sets with maybe a fee associated with it. So you could say, your supplemental data will be published and get a DOI through our workflow that we have with our repository in the workflow I've just described. If you have a critical piece of data that you would like to be checked by our experts, you can pay an extra X amount and our experts will check it. To do that, just click on this link and it will take you to a submission page. And it might be supinfo or equaldata.mit.com/submit. And that, again, look, it's on your domain. It looks like it's part of your system, but it's actually having someone submit into the workflow where the Figshare team will check those files. And that's more of a human interaction. So there's a couple of different workflows, starting at very simple, and then it gets more involved the more you want to do. And if you want to charge $340 there for every data set like Spring and Nature do, that's on your system and not on our system, obviously. Or there's ways around that. But hopefully that answered your question, Gabe.
Wonderful, thank you. We do have two other questions. One is from Kathleen. She says, do you have data on what topic areas are depositing data? Is it primarily the medical field?
Yeah, you'd be surprised. So what's been strange for me over the best part of a decade with Figshare and people sharing data is the diversity. As I mentioned before, people who generate, every research area generates files. And, we work with the publisher Brill that has plenty of maps that they want to have. You've seen the equivalent of, they're called KML files, Google Map-like things that have data plotted into them. People want to interrogate that. They don't want an image of that they can't interrogate. And so what we see is a skew towards the life sciences, as you'd expect, but and that might be to do with the funder policies, but we see large amounts of data in the social sciences and the humanities. When I say data, though, it's a very diverse range of file type. It can be anything. And then the other thing that's slightly shocking is, so when I said before, the ideal place that funders say is if there is a subject-specific repository. So I mentioned GenBank for genomic files, which is this one type of if you've got a genomic sequence, put it here. But as I said, I did genomics and I had all of these video files. Where do they go? And so what we find is areas where you think they have the problem solved, like neuroscience, which has lots of subject-specific repositories. What that actually has done is encourage neuroscientists to make all of their data available. And so neuroscience is the #1 most submitted category across all of our infrastructure, even though you'd argue that they probably have the most support for other infrastructure already. So yeah, there's a lot of people who are getting used to the idea that a lot of authors getting used to the idea that they have to make their data available, and now want to make all of it available and not just one particular file type.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, and I've heard a lot of stories of people in the humanities, you know, more and more as these type of things are available to them, it really spurs creativity, and they're seeing a lot of different types of supplemental files accompanying these types of works. So we do have one more question from Robert Wheeler. Are you familiar with NISO's draft recommended practice for reproducibility badging and definitions currently out for public comment? And if so, what are your thoughts on the implications for data?
Yeah, I'm on one of the NISO steering committees for reproducibility and replicability. So we are aware of them. I think this is exactly where we're going, right? I think the last 10 years have been all about files and metadata on the internet, right? Which is, when you think about why funders want data to be made available, academia works, right? We get drugs, but I mean, as COVID has emphasized, we can move further faster by, you know, immediate publication, making all of the data available, and building on top of the research that's gone before. And so what I think funders have tried to solve, and where we're at right now, is this idea of, if you're publishing a paper, make sure that the data, the files we need to reproduce your paper or to build on top of it, have been made available. So that's one way of doing it, is, okay, here's my files from this paper. But then the bigger viewpoint is, how can I build on top of it? Why are people reusing data sets? If it's been cited once, it's usually the paper that's saying, you know, here is the paper that I'm referencing. If it's been cited more than once by multiple authors, then it's being reused. And this idea of reuse, I think, is really important in understanding how we get to the next step, and that idea of fair for humans and machines. Just give me every data set across all these different platforms that adheres to these set of criteria that I want, and then I'm going to munge it all together and build on top of it. And I think those criteria are very important, because data has come into the world with no peer review, right? Most supplemental data doesn't get checked. The peer review system is a novel thing. I don't think, you know, there's 5 million files across Figshare infrastructure, 5 million publicly available items. So I don't think we're going to be able to scale this up to a point where the current model of peer review is going to work for data. And that's why there is interesting business models around it. But I think when people start looking for data in the future, they're going to say, I want data, but it has to meet a certain criteria. And that criteria could be, it's been checked to a certain level by a publisher, or it's been checked and we've applied this stamp to it. And I think it's very hard to do that in a machine only way. And that's why there needs to be some form of human curation, and there needs to be some kind of business model or cost model around that in order to make it sustainable. And I see, as we've already seen with folks like Springer Nature already moving into this space, that it's something that's already happening.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for that. I guess before we wrap up, one question I had was, you know, you were saying that there are all these checks that can be done, you know, very manually. Do you have, you know, through all the things that you've done and all the people you've worked with, sort of best practices that you recommend to publishers? Is that a service you provide, or, you know, just in terms of what are some best practices for naming, for workflow, for all these different things in the way that they work with their authors on the supplemental files?
Yeah, so there is a lot of information out there. We have an engagement lead called Megan Hardman, who has done a lot of case studies on this, understanding what authors are interested in. Obviously, our state of open data. If you just Google state of open data, you'll see the last 4 years of it that has the change in this over time, and some of this data around what people are interested in. Well, and what I showed before about, you know, what people can and can't do. Concerns about misuse, not receiving appropriate credit. All of these things are things that we're looking at. And when we do it with the NIH, this is level 1. This is findable, accessible. It's not looking at interoperable, reusable. So this is publicly available at this URL. I'll share these links afterwards. And so you can see exactly, we're happy to share all of the information we have. And then we do have a team focusing on some of these things at this level. Obviously, if you are a certain subject, you may have 3 extra steps that you want to check. And this is customizable per research area. But always happy to have that conversation just to share information, if nothing else.
Great. Well, thank you. Definitely more than enough to mull through moving forward. And thank you very much. We will, like we said, share all this information with everyone afterward. Thank you so much for joining us. If you'd like to follow up, please feel free to reach out either directly to Mark, to me, or to your PDM if you are a Silverchair client. I want to mention again, this is part of our series, and we will have more every month. We'll have one next month on June 16th with Sapnito, so we hope you'll be able to join us. And otherwise, thank you. Thank you, Mark, and everyone have a good rest of your day.
Thanks all.